Ready, Stephen? I'm ready. Test 1, 2, 3. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome. We are so glad you're here tonight. Appreciate those that are visiting with us. Thank you for coming. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker to us. He's no stranger to us, except the last time we saw him for several weeks, it was on the big screen. Last year when we invited Brother Joe to come, the COVID hit us, and if you recall, we had to do everything virtual. And we enjoyed his lessons, and now we get to see him in person. Thank you so much for coming. He's written several books. One that we've enjoyed here is Seeing the Unseen, and he writes other feature articles and has workshops, but he's best known for and best respected for his authority on love and marriage and sex. And we appreciate what he does to hold marriages together and helping couples. We're delighted to have you tonight. We look forward to your message.
Testing. Oh, it's on now. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. I was sorry that I couldn't make it last year, but it was a whole lot easier to do it from my desk. But thank you for inviting me up here. My friend Johnny Cardwell is one of my dearest friends on this planet. He's an awesome human being that works with me, and we've worked together for 10 years. And so I know a lot about you because of Johnny. Johnny's told me all these things about you, and I won't tell anybody else. We'll just keep it a secret, but all these things. And my friend Kenneth Grizzell came back tonight. I think he was afraid I was going to try to straighten up what he said last week, so he came to defend himself and protect himself. He's there. In case you're wondering, my PhD, my doctorate degree is from the University of Sydney in Australia, and it was earned studying about the causes of and correlations between marital satisfaction and sexual satisfaction. Notice you mentioned the word sex, so I thought I could actually say that. Sometimes people ask me questions about sex, and if you want to, please do, and I'll give them to Kenneth, and he'll come back next week and answer all those questions if you like. Okay. My topic, interestingly, then, kind of fits into the kind of thing I study and the kind of thing I do. Johnny and I both work for an organization that works with marriages, and most of the marriages we work with are marriages in crisis. I mean, they're in big trouble. And Johnny puts people into workshops. Sometimes I do them. We have other people that do them. We're now currently about to train 3 more people to help do them because of the fact that we're growing so rapidly, which is kind of a sad thing, that we're getting that many marriages in trouble that we're having to add more of our workshops. But Johnny's good about helping me with that, and we are doing our best. But understand that when you're working with marriages that are mostly in crisis, we'll work with any marriage, but working with marriages in crisis, we run across a lot of sin. Would that surprise you at all? That when marriages are in trouble, often there's sin at the root of it somewhere, either his or hers or both. And so that kind of fits into Rahab. Now, you remember the story, so I'm not going to read it in detail. It's in Joshua chapter 2 is where it starts, if you'd like to go read it again for yourself. But for the sake of time, I'm going to try to synthesize it a little bit here. Now, remember that way back, the people of God had gone down to Egypt because of the famine. Joseph was the second in control down there, and the Israelis moved down there and lived there for a long time until it became a great big number of people and things changed. A Pharaoh arose that knew not Joseph. And as things got worse and worse for them, they needed to be delivered. And finally, as you recall, you know all this already, the 10 plagues came along. Pharaoh kept saying, I'll let you go, and then he wouldn't. And so 10 plagues come along, and finally they leave. And as you recall the story, as they got to the Red Sea, the sea parted so they could walk through on the dry land. And that becomes important. So on their way out of Israel, they walked through walls of water that were being held back miraculously. Now, you also remember that they didn't get to go straight into the promised land because of the fact that the people were rebelling against God. They didn't trust him. And so now they have to wander 40 years in the desert. You remember that God fed them with the manna. You know all of this. Just want to make sure you get the story back. But they're coming out of Egypt. And so if you were in Israel, now let's just say that this long corridor here would represent the country of Israel because it's relatively thin. And Egypt would be way down there to the south and then over to the east a little bit, right? And so they had come, and rather than coming up through the Negev, or through the desert, straight in here. God, because of their sin, because of their doubt, basically, sent them over to wander around in the wilderness out there for about 40 years. And finally, under the leadership of Joshua, it's time for them to come into the land of Israel. Now, they've gone all the way out here. I got this backwards, basically, because that'll be west now. Okay? They've all gone out here to the west, and they're going to come through. And there's 3 million of them or so, based on the best estimates. And they're going to come through the Jordan River. And so now Joshua sends some people in to check things out. He said, I really want you to find out some things about this city called Jericho. And so these 2 spies come into the city of Jericho. Now, the Bible says that they went to the household of a woman by the name of Rahab, who was a prostitute. And so we can assume a couple of things there. One is that they were looking for some place that people wouldn't suspect them of doing something like spying if they went to that particular place. And so they must have asked around out there somewhere, are there any prostitutes? Well, yes, we know one. Her name is Rahab. And so they decide to go to Rahab's house, and they start talking to her. Now, Rahab lets them know that they had heard that they were coming, that the people in Jericho had heard that the Israelites were coming. And she goes all the way back 40 years. Now, it's highly unlikely she's 40 years old. So she's talking about things now that happened before she was even born. And she says, we've heard about how the Red Sea was parted, and you guys came through there, how that you came past certain kingdoms, and so she's going over a period of time here. And when those kingdoms tried to stop you or get in your way, you defeated them. And we've been hearing all these things, and we've been keeping up with you. And now we know that you're just a little over 7 miles away. Because from the River Jordan to Jericho is about 7 miles. Now, she didn't use that number. She doesn't say that, but we know that from looking at it. They're about 7 miles away. Now, they're on the other side. And the people in Jericho might have felt a little bit of security because the Jordan River at this particular time was flooding, and that might make them not have the ability to come through. But they also know the story. So the last time water was in their way, God worked a miracle and stopped it, and they came through on the dry land. And so they're really worried about this. And they had been watching for spies. You say, how do you know? Based on what they do next. Because they ask if there's any strangers in town, and they said, yeah, there are 2 guys that came, and they went up to see Rahab. Now, in the meantime, when Rahab's having this conversation with them, she's basically saying, the God you worship is the real God. We know that from the stories that we've heard. And so she really is a person of faith. But her faith is based on the testimony of other people. I've heard that you did this. I've heard that you did that. I hear that you did the other. Therefore, your God must be the most powerful God, and he's with you. He's on your side. And that's the kind of faith she has. But it's kind of interesting because when you look in the New Testament, in the book of James, which is really all about faith, it talks about the difference in a living faith and a dead faith. Notice that a living faith can be strong. A living faith can be mediocre. A living faith can be weak. But if it's alive, if it's still a living faith, according to what James would tell us, then that's what saves us. Okay? The fact that our faith is alive, that God saves us by grace through faith. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, that not of ourselves, so that we don't boast. And so she has faith. We wouldn't say she's got strong faith. We wouldn't say that she's got a theologically based faith. All her faith is just based on anecdotes, just based on stories. But it's enough faith that she's going to be saved. Now, you say, why are you making a big point about that? It's kind of like this. Sometimes, did anybody else grow up in such a way as to where you felt like your faith had to be perfect, and if you died when it wasn't perfect, you were in trouble? Anybody else feel like that? See, my big fear growing up was I was going to die between prayers. Because I'd do something wrong, and then I wouldn't have time to pray. Like if I stepped out in front of the bus, I know what word would come out of my mouth. And I wouldn't have time to pray for forgiveness about that. And it's like, Lord, don't let me get hit by a bus that I see coming. If it doesn't see it, if I don't see it, that's fine. And so I lived in that kind of fear, making, wow, my faith's not strong enough. To the point that when I was a boy, back in the late 1800s, if somebody would have asked one of us, are you going to heaven? We in the Churches of Christ would typically answer, in what way? I don't know. I'll find out someday, which is no security whatsoever. And so when you get to 1 John, you find 1 John, it states that one of his clear purposes of writing a book was so that you know that you have eternal life. And we were so afraid because maybe it's not strong enough. Rahab can give us an idea here. When I used to live in Evansville, Indiana, I was preaching for a church up there. And I ran into this guy one time, and he said, what do you do? Well, Washington Avenue Church right down here, I'm the lead minister, which was a nice way of saying I'm all they got. I'm the lead minister down there. And he said, it's Church of Christ. And I said, yes. He said, the one that's headquartered in Nashville. I know people think that, but not necessarily. He said, okay, I have one question for you. Every time I've run into somebody from the Church of Christ, I've asked the same question. I want to see if your answer is any different. Okay, what's the question? If you were to die right now, would you go to heaven? And I said, yes, sir. He said, wait a minute. You said you went to the Church of Christ. I said, yes. He said, you sure it's not the United Church of Christ? I said, oh, no, there's nothing united about us. We're not going to get that thing worked out there. And he said, but you actually believe you're going to heaven? I said, yes. He said, so you're sinlessly perfect. No, I'm sinless because I'm forgiven. I walk in the light as he is in the light, 1 John 1:7, and the blood cleanses me from all sin. But are there days when sometimes you do anything wrong? So I'll ask you that question. Anybody here ever sin? Okay. Anybody ever sin so badly that it keeps you awake at night worrying about what you did? Yeah. What was it? Nobody's going to answer that question, right? And you say, somehow, with Rahab, you're finding faith and strength? Absolutely. She's listed in Hebrews chapter 11 as a woman of faith. Now, stay with her. So she talks to these guys, and then she realizes that people have seen them come there. Again, another indication that they'd ask, who's the prostitute? Who's the most known prostitute? Which means that she probably had a thriving business. The things that she was doing were things that were wrong. Okay? Over the centuries, many people have tried to change that word into meaning something else. That she was this, she was that, she was the other. But nobody's ever been able to do that successfully because she was a prostitute. Okay, both in the book of Joshua chapter 2 and in Hebrews chapter 11, she's referred to that way. And so when she talks to these guys, she realizes they're going to come looking for you because they've been waiting. I mean, they've known that you've been coming through that desert for a long time. And they figured that you were going to come through somewhere around here. Now, if you ever go to Israel, by the way, how many of you guys have ever been to Israel? Cool. Okay. Then you know that when you get to where they were on the other side over there, there's this big hills. They would call mountains, but we're from Tennessee. And so there are these big hills over there. And if you're going to come across the Jordan River, you've got to find a place where you can take a couple of million people at minimum down through some kind of a pathway to the Jordan and go across the Jordan. And the perfect place to do that is where you'll be just 7 miles from Jericho. Therefore, they figured if they're coming this way, this is where they're going to come through. So they're looking at everything. Strange men come to town. Who are you? What are you doing? Third degree. So they go to find these guys. But in the meantime, Rahab's had that conversation with them, and she said, I know that the God you serve is God. So I'm asking for you to deliver me and my family when this great big battle we've been anticipating occurs. Would you spare us? So they make a deal with her. Yes, but a couple of things you got to do. Number one, now she lived in a house that was actually built into the wall, which means her window, it would have been up high, by the way, because otherwise people could just walk through it. A high window up here, and they said you hang this scarlet piece of cloth out there, and you have all of your family in this same little house with you when we come back. Now, if they're out on the streets, they're going to die like everybody else, so you have them here with you. And so she now, with that promise in mind, takes them up to the roof. She puts them under some flax that she's been working on, hiding them under there. Sure enough, the people from Jericho get there, the security guards, if you will, and they say, okay, we heard a couple of men came here. Where are they? Well, yeah, I had a couple of clients, but they left before it got dark, and they're not here anymore, and they headed back toward the river. And so these guys take off back toward the river. They're trying to find out if indeed they can catch up with these guys before they cross the river. And they've got a good shot because the river's flooded at this point, and they go that way. She goes back up to the top up there, and she tells them, all right, I've sent them in the wrong direction. Now, you go out my window, go down to the side, and you go up into the hills, and you hide for at least 3 days until they finally quit looking for you. And when they finally quit looking for you, then you can go back. And so that's what they did. They go back to the other side. And we're going to make some points out of this in a couple of minutes. They go back to the other side. And when they get there, they tell Joshua what's going on. He says, we're going to honor your oath to this woman. We're going to do exactly what you said. And then it's time to cross the Jordan, which is flooded. And so they walked through water on dry land to leave Egypt. They're going to walk through water on dry land to come into the promised land. There was water at each end of that trip. And they walk through there because the people who are carrying the Ark of the Covenant walk into the water and stop, standing in the water. And God stops the water right there. Even though it was at flood stage, they stop it right there. So there's no water going further downstream. And now everybody comes across. Everybody comes across. And then the last people to come out are the guys holding the Ark of the Covenant. And now they're in fighting range. Okay, you know what happened next, right? Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. Anybody remember that old song from way back? Okay. They walked around it. They blew the trumpets. They did all the things that God told them to do. The walls fell. I read several years ago some interesting thing in archaeology that when they found Jericho and started digging it up, as the archaeologists would do, that unlike most cities that have been attacked where the walls fell in, Jericho's walls fell out, indicating that something unusual had occurred there. So what's the point? Rahab is spared. Rahab's family is spared. Do you think if Rahab lived in our day and time and walked into a typical church where that everybody in town knew what she did for a living, how do you think most churches would react to her attending? I mean, I thought I asked a question. Sorry.
Not positive, be in a negative way.
In a negative way, such as?
They would all be talking about her.
All be talking about her.
Over there on that pew.
Ask not to come back.
Not to come back? I actually know situations where that's happened. No, not her. She's been dead a long time. But I actually know situations where that has occurred, where people who have done some public sin came to church and were told they weren't welcome there, not to come back. I know of one that happened in the great state of Tennessee, where I live, where a woman had an affair, which was a sin, and her husband divorced her, and she wanted to come back to church, and she came to a church, and so they met with her and said, you can only come here if you don't take a church directory. Somehow that was going to corrupt all the people if she knew how to call them. And there was a guy in that church, this was several years ago now, so the guy may be gone on now. He was an older gentleman who carried pockets full of candy that he would give to all the little kids. And he walked over to my friend, this lady I'm telling you about, and held out a piece of candy to her child, who was just a toddler at that time. And a woman grabbed his hand and said, don't touch that baby. Do you know who she is? And so it was like, what are you going to do? She said, I want to keep going to church. They treat me as if I'm accursed, but I'm going to keep going to church. There's a story in Luke about Jesus being invited to this Pharisee's house to eat. That was kind of the custom back then. If there was a visiting evangelist or rabbi, it would be in their case, a visiting rabbi, the leading person in the church, that would be their synagogue, of course, would invite that person to come so this famous rabbi could come to his house to eat. Now, back in those days, they didn't sit at chairs when they ate. That picture, the Da Vinci picture, remember the Da Vinci picture of the Last Supper, where everybody said, get on this side of the table for the picker? That's not how they did it. They would lie on their left side on their arm like this at an angle away from the table and eat with their right hand. Now, we did that once when I was a teenager just to see what it was like. It was amazing. Because as teenage boys, we could rake food into our mouths if you do that. And so that was the way they would do that. They would have that meal. And so Jesus was invited in. He's the visiting rabbi. And the dignitaries are invited, some of them invited to eat, but the rest of the town people that want to be there, where the happening is, can come in, but they're not invited to eat. And so they'll just stand around the wall. You remember the story, do you not? Can you imagine if there are people standing outside waiting for the meal to begin, just chatting and talking like people do, and she's coming down the street? A woman who is a sinner in that town, which we infer, meaning she was a prostitute. And so she's coming down the street, headed that direction. I can just imagine the conversations of the people in the yard, can't you? Like, where does she think she's going? Surely she's not coming here. Then she turns into that little sidewalk, if you will, and headed toward the house. Can you believe that hussy being so brassy as to come here? As a matter of fact, they may even have tried to keep her out. I mean, things where that they would just kind of turn their back and be side by side and just make like they don't see her. They could have done all kinds of things, but this woman was looking for God. Nobody was going to stop her. So she pushes on through. She goes into the room. She's not been invited to eat, so she can't lie at the table. She goes around to where she's standing directly behind Jesus. And she starts to cry. You recall that she wasn't just silently weeping. This woman was obviously sobbing because of the fact that she had so much water, so many tears, that it began to make patterns in Jesus' feet, which were dusty from the walking over there. And then she tries to wipe those away, and so she's down on her knees now, and she's trying to wipe the tracks of her tears off of his feet, and everybody's looking at her. And the Pharisee thinks to himself, he's supposed to be the man of God? He's letting that woman touch him? No, he must not be. You know, one of the things that they had trouble figuring out was how that Jesus always whipped them in a debate, because he always knew what they were thinking, which gave him, a slight advantage here. And she keeps washing it, and then she gets it clean, and now she thinks, I've got to dry it. I've got to dry his feet. And she doesn't have anything she thinks is clean enough. And so she does something no Jewish woman would ever do in public. She takes down her hair. I can't help but wonder how many men in that room had seen her take down her hair. But now they were at the big church supper. So some of the guys in that room probably were not saying a word because they're thinking, good grief, why is she here? What's she going to do? Who's she going to talk about? And so I'm thinking some of the people in that room were frozen with fear. The others were just outright indignant. How dare she? And you remember how that story goes. That he has to tell her 3 times that she's forgiven. 3. I don't know exactly why, but I have an idea. The first time he actually says it to the Pharisee about her. Oh, by the way, do you think Jesus had a sense of humor? Really interesting thing that occurred in that story. At one point, he looks at Simon, the Pharisee, and he said, did you happen to see that woman? I think that's one of the funniest verses in the whole scripture right there. You think anybody in that room has missed that woman? Anybody in that house has missed that woman? I mean, tongue in cheek. And so he tells her she's forgiven, and he does it 3 times. Why? Again, I don't know, but I have an opinion. Anybody ever been in the town center? What I mean is they've done something that just everybody knows about, and that people sit in judgment on you because of that. Because I asked a little while ago what it was, you're not going to say anything here, are you? We don't want to reveal. I have been in the town center where it seemed like everybody knew about my sin. My friend Jack Exum, who died a few years ago, I told him once, I said, Jack, everybody's talking about me. He said, what an ego. Most people don't even know who you are. Okay. But if you've been to town center, then you know how it works. that if you walk into a place, and this actually happened. I had been the minister for a church in Montgomery, Alabama. I committed a sin and was caught, and it was publicized far and wide. This was way before the internet, so it took almost 3 whole minutes to go all across America. And my church that I was a member of there terminated me, which they should have because of what I did. I was their minister, they terminated me. And I had some experiences where I would go visit places. I remember walking into the one situation where there were about 150 ministers. And I walked into the room and they parted like the Red Sea. They just opened up and I walked right down to the middle of them and sat down and listened to the lecture. And when I got up to leave, they were all mingling again. But when I came out, they parted like the Red Sea so I could walk back out. And I thought, wow, at least they know who I am. But they don't want me here. I wonder how many people in a community such as Franklin are people who are sinners to the degree they would think of themselves maybe even as a town center. Maybe it's not because they're a prostitute, but maybe it's because of their drug use. Maybe it's because of the fact that they're getting drunk every Friday night. Or maybe because of, name the sin. They're in this, that, or the other. Who, if they go to church, go as a hypocrite. What I mean is they pretend they don't have any sin. Because the word hypocrite actually what it means to act. And so they'll go to church and they'll act like they have no sin. What do you think would happen if they filled a church like this church? Was full of people who understand that sin is wrong, but God is love. And that God not only would redeem a prostitute based on weak faith only gained through an anecdotal process, but that she became part and parcel of what was happening in Judaism, and she became one of the women in the lineage of Jesus. That this prostitute was chosen by God to be one of the women in the lineage that would actually bring the Messiah. As a matter of fact, that scarlet thing that she had hanging out the window, it's kind of interesting how maybe that can be symbolized as referring to the blood of Jesus. And so here it is hanging out the window, and they see that. And this woman not only is saved, but this woman is actually part of our salvation. And she was the town center. And so when Jesus forgave that woman who was washing his feet with her tears, that everybody else thought, how in the world can you let that woman touch you? Maybe touching is exactly what she needed.
We're all sinners. Some of us just forgot we are.
Well, if you're old enough, you may have forgotten some of them. That's true.
Well, I said that, or maybe we don't think we are, but we are all.
Well, everybody's.
Maybe we don't realize we are, we don't act like we are.
I had a guy make a sign for me years ago that I could put on look right here in my pocket when I was flying. And I would fly, I would wear it. It said, Joe Beam, known sinner. I wore that so nobody would talk to me. Joe Beam, known sinner. Oh, it had another line on it. Saved by grace. Every one of us is a sinner saved by grace. But it's awfully hard sometimes to give grace to other people based on what sin that they do. When AIDS was still relatively misunderstood, remember when in the first wave of that, and we didn't know how you'd get it and everything else at that point, and there was a brother in the Lord, who had straightened out his life, had given himself back to God, but he was dying, and I was talking to him one day, and I could tell he wanted somebody to touch him because nobody would. We thought back then if you just touched him, you might get AIDS. Anybody remember back in those days? And I thought, what would Jesus do? No, I didn't start that, but what would Jesus do I swallowed my breath, stepped up, put my arms around that guy and hugged him thinking, Lord, I'm coming home. But he needed that. He needed somebody to touch him. Then later, I was speaking at a church down in Tampa, Florida. One of my students, when I taught Bible at what was then Alabama Christian College, today it's Faulkner University, one of my students had been in my Bible classes at Faulkner. I hadn't seen him in years. Comes walking into the room, and this guy looked like he just stepped out of a page of GQ magazine. You understand? He was perfectly coiffed, perfectly dressed. And he walked up to me, and everybody's looking at him because he's just amazing to look at this guy, like he really just came out of a magazine or something. He said, can we talk for a minute? I said, yeah, I haven't seen you in years, sure. So we go out and we go into a classroom, and he looks at me and he says, I'm dying. I knew what he had struggled with when he was in college, so I said, AIDS? Yeah. I said, okay, what I'll do is I'll go find the elders of this church, I'll bring them in here, and we'll all pray. He said, no, I don't want you to pray that I live. You don't want us to pray that you live. No. Why not? I don't know that I can handle the temptation. He told me a lot of things that he had done. He didn't give graphic detail. He just gave an overview. A lot of the things that he had done. And he said, I don't know if I weren't dying, if I would have the strength to stop that. So it's not that I want God to heal me. I just want God not to draw it out. So I can die while I have peace. And so I prayed with him. It's kind of unusual when you actually have done it a couple of times at their request, but it's kind of unusual when you pray to somebody, Lord, please take this man's life. It's up to you, not us. He's not going to commit suicide. I'm not going to kill him. I know it's your choice. But if you do that, because, Lord, he's in torment, and he just wants to have peace. A couple of weeks later, I was speaking in Texas. My wife tracked me down at the church where I was speaking. I was actually sitting in the minister's office, and the call came through. And she mentioned my friend's name, and she said, he's dead. What happened? He was walking across one of these bridges that open up to let the boats go through. Apparently, he didn't hear the siren, the warning sign. And so when it first lurched up, it threw him against the rail, and that broke his leg. And he went over the rail into the water with his leg broken. And because his leg was broken, he couldn't stay above water, and he drowned. I wept. He was my friend. I loved him. I wept. And in my tears, I thanked God. Because I know what it's like to live with a temptation that you don't know if you can resist it if it comes again. I'm not saying you can't, but it feels like you can't. Am I the only one here that's ever experienced that? I realize you'll be committing to something if you shake your head yes or no, either way. But I'm going to assume that all of you, at some point or another, has had something that you promised God you would never do again, and then you did it again. And then you promised God a second time. I meant it the first time. I really did. I know I shouldn't have done it, but if you can just find it in your heart, God, to forgive me just one more time, I promise I'll never do it again. Anybody here ever done that? You ever do it again? Most of us have. You say, Dr. Beam, are you telling us that that's okay? No, I'm telling you it's sin. It's wrong. It does damage. But I'm telling you that those people who hurt like the woman who washed Jesus' feet, who hurt like Rahab did when she realized that death was on the way to that city, if those people knew they were welcome in a church before they got to be good people. Romans 5:8, while we were yet sinners, God loved us. Christ died for us. Right? I filled in for a church down in Franklin, Tennessee for a while. Johnny was in that church then there with us. And Johnny, you remember what happened to our attendance? That church went from like 400 to 1,100 in attendance in a matter of months, just a few months. And you say, you're that good a preacher? Well, you've already figured that out for yourself, whether I am or not. But it was the fact that when I was preaching at that church, I had nothing left to lose. I was the sinner who'd been forgiven, known sinner saved by grace. And so I just preached a lot about sin and salvation, which is kind of interesting because when I visit churches, I very seldom hear a sermon on sin. And if I do hear a sermon on sin, there's no second part about how God redeems. It's just the sin part without the redeeming part. But we were preaching that, not because I'm brilliant, just because of the fact that that's what I experienced. The grace that people had given me, the grace that God had given me, and I never expected to ever stand in a pulpit again, ever, because of what I'd done. And the blessings came. And the people came. They came. I heard one of them say this. Now, it's going to sound like I'm trying to build myself up. Forgive me, I don't mean it to be that way. But here's what one of them said. We heard there was one of us in the pulpit. What do you mean? That you're as messed up as we are. Probably more. I've offered several times to compare sins, but they're always terrified of what I actually did. So nobody wants to compare sins with me. And I'm not boasting in my sin. I'm boasting in my salvation. I'm boasting to know how bad you are. So how would you communicate that? How would you let the world out there know, listen, you can come here before you get off the drugs. And we're going to love you out of them. You can come here before you get out of that illicit relationship, and we're going to love you out of it. They're looking for life, not the death they're living. And they're looking for love. Somebody who sees through the sin. While we were yet sinners, God loved us. Christ died for us. And literally can fill a church building. Now here's the problem. They're not all going to look like you. They're not all going to smell like you. And they certainly aren't all going to talk like you. And some of the words that they will say will freak you out. And I don't mean profanity. They just don't know our language. You understand? And if any church, Bowling Green, Franklin, wherever it might be, can continue to love those people and show them Jesus, touch them. Help them understand what forgiveness is and how wonderful it is to be forgiven, which means that we have to be open about our own sin. I don't mean bragging about it, but just enough for them to know that we understand. Now, I noticed that a great number of the people here are my age, right? So we're all, what, about to die? Is that right? Something like that. What I have found over the years is that Christians get older, if they get into the 70s, 80s kind of thing, they do one of two things. They either become harsh legalists or they become the greatest purveyors of grace you've ever met. Because they've lived long enough, experienced enough on their own failures, or the failures of their children, or the failures of their friends, that they want to give grace. And so I actually think a church with a lot of older people would have more success bringing people to Jesus than just all the young people, because I don't even know half of what they say means. But that's what Rahab was all about. A prostitute who became a great-great-great-grandmother, I don't know how many grays go in there, to the Lord Jesus Christ because of the fact that God forgives sinners. Now, think about it this, and I'll end. She's in the 11th chapter of Hebrews in that hero section, people who are heroes because of their faith. And yet this woman's faith, when she acted, was very weak. Just based on anecdotes, that's all. And then if you think about that, but that was enough? That was enough. Think about that, then think about how the Apostle Paul preached. Go through the book of Acts, for example, and look at some of his sermons. And basically, a lot of Paul's sermons had to do with this. Let me tell you what I was. Let me tell you what God did. Let me tell you who I am now. And in that process of being open and transparent, not glorying in sin, but not hiding it either. Who knows? There may be a lot of Rahabs out there who just need a chance at life. That's all I got to say.
Thank you so much. Sure enjoyed it. Let's all stand. We'll have prayer together. Dear Father, you've been so good to us. Thank you